Nora Blake hadn't planned on buying a house this far out, but something about the quiet edges of Arbor Creek spoke to her in a way the city no longer could. After her marriage ended in a process so devoid of drama it somehow felt more cruel, she found herself unmoored, quietly unraveling behind the routines that had once kept her life in order. When she first saw the listing, a modest, single-story home with a sloped backyard and a wraparound porch shaded by a weathered maple tree, she didn't feel excitement. She felt relief. The kind that comes not with beginnings but with endings that finally allows space for stillness. It was a bank-owned property, the kind realtors call distressed, but to her it just looked like something waiting to be claimed again. It wasn't big, it wasn't new, and it certainly wasn't what she had imagined owning at this point in her life, but it was enough, and more than anything, it was hers. Moving day came with overcast skies and the smell of distant rain. Nora backed her rental truck into the gravel driveway herself. No friends, no family helping. She had long since grown used to doing things alone. The air was cleaner than she remembered from the first visit, the kind of fresh that wrapped around her lungs like cold cotton. She was unloading a second box of books when a figure appeared on the edge of her property, just behind the mail post. A woman, late 60s perhaps, in a windbreaker and pressed jeans, stood with hands tucked neatly into her jacket pockets. She wasn't smiling, but neither did she look aggressive, just quietly present. Nora waved out of reflex, not quite sure if the woman was passing by or stopping deliberately. "You're moving in?" the woman asked, her voice sharp but not impolite. "I am," Nora said, brushing dust from her jeans and walking closer. The woman nodded once, not extending a name or a hand. Her eyes were a muted blue, clear and dry like chipped porcelain. "This house sat too long empty. Doesn't like it. The last ones didn't stay." Nora blinked. "Well, I'm hoping to break the pattern." The woman tilted her head. "You're not from around here, not local." "No, I'm from the city originally. Needed some quiet, some space." The woman looked past her toward the house. "This house isn't about quiet. It's about history. You can paint the walls, put in your own curtains, but some places, they remember who they belong to." It was so strange a comment that Nora didn't answer right away. But before she could find a polite way to close the conversation, the woman offered a dry, almost dismissive smile and turned to walk away. She paused just at the edge of the gravel and said over her shoulder, "You look like someone renting time, not someone staying." That was the first time Nora saw her. She didn't introduce herself, and Nora didn't ask for her name, though she found out later from the county appraiser's site and a neighbor's passing comment that the woman's name was Karen Aldridge, and she had lived across the road in that same house for over 30 years. She had a husband once, but no one saw him anymore. Some said he'd passed, others said he'd left. Whatever the truth, Karen acted as if the entire road, maybe even the town, was something she maintained by sheer presence alone. The first few days passed uneventfully. Nora unpacked, deep-cleaned the baseboards, installed a new set of deadbolts, and took long walks around the perimeter of her property. The house had that smell of aged wood and dust that clung even after a good scrubbing, but it was solid. It creaked honestly. She planted small hedges along the front to replace the brittle shrubs the bank had left to die, and though her knees ached from the work, she felt something unfamiliar creeping back into her chest. Control. Not happiness, not yet, but control. Ownership. Karen, however, never disappeared entirely. Nora began to notice the way her porch light clicked on exactly at dusk and turned off at dawn, even on nights when no one sat outside. Sometimes Karen would appear near her own mailbox, staring at nothing for long stretches of time, as if waiting for something that never came. Other times, she would walk to the edge of the road and stop directly across from Nora's driveway, just far enough to not trespass, but close enough to be seen. Nora didn't wave again. She pretended not to notice, but something in her chest always tightened when it happened. She didn't scare easily, Years in the city had taught her to read real danger. But this was different. This wasn't aggression, it was possession. Not of Nora herself, but of the space she occupied. As if Karen believed the house, the property, the air around it still belonged to someone else, and Nora was just a squatter in a place with invisible terms. The mail came inconsistently, a mix of forwarded letters and circulars from businesses she didn't recognize. One morning, she found a yellowed envelope without a return address tucked into the mailbox, sealed with moisture and care, addressed simply to occupant. Inside was a single page, typewritten with the following line: "It doesn't want you here, and neither do we." No threats, no signature, just a single sentence with the kind of precision that didn't feel childish or meant as a joke. She brought the letter inside, laid it on the table, and stared at it for several minutes. Then she slid it into a drawer and didn't speak of it again, not even to the neighbor across the road, an older man named Carl who occasionally waved from his porch but never ventured conversation beyond the weather. What would she say? That a woman she barely knew had taken an unspoken claim on her property? That someone was leaving messages without footprints? She knew better. In a town this size, accusations became gossip, and gossip became labels, and she had no interest in becoming the new, unpleasant city woman who couldn't handle the country. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She reinforced her routines. She repaired the back fence, replaced the broken lock on the shed, kept a clipboard of dates and tasks. If someone wanted to rattle her, they'd have to get through a mind trained on logistics, not emotion. And yet, every so often she would find small, unsettling details. A row of stones carefully laid at the foot of her porch. A piece of ribbon tied to a low branch in the backyard. Once a pile of dirt freshly disturbed near the edge of her property line, as if someone had started digging and stopped suddenly. Each thing on its own could be explained, but together they formed a pattern that felt pointed. Then came the second encounter. It had been raining hard, washing the gravel road into streaks of reddish clay. Nora returned from town, maneuvering her car slowly into the drive, and found Karen standing in the middle of the yard, not on the road, not near the mailbox, but halfway to the porch. She wasn't dressed for the rain. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her scalp, and her arms hung loosely at her sides. Nora got out of the car, umbrella forgotten in the seat, and stared at the woman. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice steady. Karen didn't flinch. "I walked this land before you were ever here. That doesn't make it yours." Karen stepped back once, then twice, water dripping from the hem of her coat. "You don't deserve this property. It's not yours to keep." Then she turned and walked away. Nora didn't follow. She didn't call the police. She stood in the rain until Karen's figure disappeared behind the hedges, and then she went inside, peeled off her wet clothes, and sat on the floor in front of the locked door, feeling something coil deep in her gut. A sensation not of fear, but of warning, that this wasn't just about her, that something had been set in motion the moment she signed the papers and took possession of the house. Something that wouldn't be resolved by ignoring it. Something that had roots much deeper than the fresh hedges she'd planted out front. And outside, across the road, a porch light flickered to life. Always on time, always watching. It was a Wednesday morning when the silence broke. The kind of silence that had become a kind of comfort for Nora, a steady companion in a town where time didn't move so much as hum faintly beneath the surface. She had woken early, just before 6, poured a cup of coffee, and stepped onto the porch to watch the fog lift off the fields behind her property like breath from the land itself. The air was still cool, clinging to the wood beneath her bare feet, and for a moment everything felt suspended, still enough that even the birds hadn't started their morning chorus. But then came the sound. A crunch, low and deliberate, like something heavy rolling over damp gravel. Too controlled to be natural. Not wind, not rain, not wildlife. Something mechanical, slow, and far too deliberate. She stood completely still, cup halfway to her lips, until the noise came again. Closer this time. She stepped off the porch and moved around the side of the house, her eyes narrowing at the sight of deep ruts freshly carved into the gravel road that curved alongside her property. Not tire marks from a regular vehicle. These were wide, dense, the kind left by something industrial. A delivery truck, maybe. But there was no sign of one now, and she hadn't ordered anything large enough to warrant a freight delivery. Her attention shifted when she noticed something strange near the mailbox. It was gone. Where the post had stood the day before, weathered wood painted white with a rusted flag, there was now only a jagged stump, cleanly splintered, surrounded by disturbed earth and the unmistakable imprint of treads. Large treads. She walked toward it slowly, coffee forgotten on the porch rail, her feet crunching over loose gravel as she knelt beside the remains of the post. The break wasn't accidental. It had been crushed deliberately, the force of it enough to drive the entire base of the mailbox into the ground at an angle. She scanned the road. No debris, no vehicle, no explanation. Just quiet damage, fresh and stark against the morning light. Nora stood and looked across the road. Karen's house was still and dim, no sign of movement, but she felt certain, unreasonably certain, that she was being watched. She went back inside, found her phone, and snapped a few photos of the treads, the broken post, the torn-up edge of her lawn where something heavy had briefly veered off the road. She didn't want to assume, but there was no plausible explanation that made this look like an accident. She debated calling the police, but even as her finger hovered over the dial, she hesitated. What would she say? That someone, possibly her neighbor, had driven heavy machinery close enough to her home to destroy her mailbox in the dead of night? Without footage, without proof, it would be chalked up to speculation, maybe vandalism at best, and vandalism wasn't a priority in towns like this unless someone ended up bleeding. Still, something inside her had shifted. It wasn't fear, at least not the frantic kind. It was awareness, a rising sense that her presence here had officially been challenged. Later that afternoon, she walked into town and stopped by the small office that served as a combined public records center and rental agency for construction equipment. The woman behind the desk, whose name tag read Tina in bold red letters, looked up from her crossword puzzle with mild disinterest until Nora explained what she was looking for. She wanted to know if any heavy equipment had been rented out or authorized to operate near her address within the last 24 hours. Tina pulled up the digital logbook and scanned it with a shrug. There had been 2 rentals. One a mini excavator, the other a compact loader, but both had been contracted for jobs on the other side of the highway. No addresses matched hers. But then she paused. There was a same-day rental yesterday, Tina said, tapping the screen. One of the short-term locals, Aldridge, Karen, just for the morning, didn't list a delivery drop, said she'd drive it herself. She said it casually, but it landed like a brick in Nora's chest. She forced herself to nod. Any idea what for? Tina raised an eyebrow. Probably yard work. A lot of people out here do that kind of thing themselves. But hey, she added with a small smirk, not everyone tears up a driveway for fun. Was it close to your place? Nora smiled, tight-lipped. Close enough. She didn't confront Karen, not immediately. There was something too deliberate in the act to treat it like a childish stunt. She needed a pattern, not a one-off, and patterns, she knew, revealed themselves when you paid attention to the quiet, not the noise. So she spent the next few days watching, noting everything. Karen didn't acknowledge her, not directly, but she was always there, in the periphery, stepping out to collect mail that never came, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, staring a beat too long at the house across the street. One morning, Nora noticed that Karen had moved one of her lawn chairs from the side porch to the front lawn. Not by accident, not casually, but facing directly at Nora's driveway. It remained empty for most of the day, but it was there, positioned like a sentry, as though someone was keeping vigil over a line no one else could see. Then came the second letter. No envelope this time. Just a single sheet of paper folded neatly into thirds and slid between the slats of her storm door. It was typed again, the font slightly different this time, but with the same unmistakable tone. Some properties reject the wrong owners. You'll feel it soon. There was no address, no punctuation, not even a smear or fingerprint. Just words, left like a calling card. Nora didn't bring it inside. She unfolded it carefully with latex gloves she kept under the sink and placed it in a Ziploc bag before driving it straight to the sheriff's substation. The officer at the desk took it with a sigh, nodding as she explained her suspicions but made no promises. "Unless it escalates, ma'am, there's not much we can do about anonymous notes. Happens sometimes with newcomers. People get territorial." Territorial. The word stuck with her long after she left. This wasn't territory in the legal sense. This was something older, more primal. Karen didn't want to own Nora's land. She wanted Nora to relinquish it, to surrender it by choice. And if that couldn't be achieved through fear, it would be through attrition, inch by inch, act by act, until Nora felt so worn down that staying felt heavier than leaving. But Nora wasn't built for quitting. The way her hands moved with quiet precision, the way she documented everything, filed every receipt, kept every calendar color-coded, it wasn't just habit, it was armor. She didn't respond with anger or confrontation. Instead, she installed a motion light at the front door, aimed toward the mailbox. She kept a small notebook of daily observations: who parked where, what time, porch lights turned on, what shifted outside the house. She reviewed property lines again, made copies of her deed, even drove to the town assessor's office to request archived surveys of the land in case someone tried to claim otherwise. And yet, even with her logic sharpened and her routines fortified, she couldn't shake the feeling that something irrational was now circling her life, that the broken mailbox was not the act of a petty vandal, but a message written in metal and gravel, meant to remind her that permanence here was not hers to assume. 3 nights later, she woke at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of something scraping against her porch. Not loud, just steady, rhythmic, the kind of noise that's soft enough to make you question whether it's real. She sat up, held her breath, and listened. It stopped. Then a creak, a groan of wood under weight. She moved slowly, lifting the curtain beside her bed just an inch. The porch was empty, but the chair she'd left beside the window was turned. It now faced the road. In the morning, she found new marks, fine lines in the paint near the doorframe, shallow but deliberate, and on the edge of her porch rail, barely visible, was a smudge of earth. Not dirt, earth. The kind that clings to the soles of boots after something has been uprooted. She spent the rest of the morning not cleaning, not fixing, but preparing. She made a second copy of the property documents, arranged for a consultation with a local attorney who specialized in land disputes, and moved the second outdoor camera to an angle that overlooked the entire front yard. She wasn't afraid of confrontation, but she knew instinctively that whoever, or whatever, was testing her wasn't interested in a single victory. This was about endurance, about watching something strong crumble slowly. But Nora Blake had crumbled before, and she knew exactly how long it took to rebuild. This time she would not hand over anything. Not a mailbox, not a line of gravel, and certainly not her ground. Not without a fight. The morning after the porch incident, Nora awoke not to the sound of birds or distant traffic, but to the unsettling silence of suspended tension, the kind of silence that suggested something had already happened and was waiting to be noticed. She pulled on a sweatshirt, stepped onto the porch, and immediately saw the change. Her mailbox, replaced only a few weeks prior after the first incident, now leaned at an angle, twisted on its post as if someone had grabbed it by hand and tried to wrench it out of the ground. The base was splintered again, but this time there were no heavy tire tracks, No signs of machinery, just the crude marks of boot heels in the mud, deliberate and deep. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted speed or efficiency. They'd wanted her to notice the effort. She didn't swear. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she walked to the shed and returned with a camera, taking 6 slow, measured photos before lifting the broken fixture and placing it gently against the house. Her steps were methodical, her breath steady, but the churning in her gut was no longer just wariness. It was fury, precise and controlled, and it demanded direction. Nora spent the next 2 hours assembling a packet. Copies of the property deed, photos of both mailbox incidents, a printout of the rental records she had requested showing Karen's equipment use, and a list of observed disturbances including dates, times, and correlating details. She placed them in a folder and drove straight to her attorney's office, not with panic but with preparation. The attorney, a wiry man in his 50s named Keene, flipped through the documents slowly, his expression unreadable until he reached the photos of the mailbox. He sighed, leaned back, and said quietly, "You're doing the right thing by documenting this. But unless she physically enters your home or causes serious damage, enforcement options are limited. We can draft a formal cease and desist, maybe even a restraining order if she escalates further. But you need to be prepared that this kind of neighbor dispute isn't usually resolved quickly. These things are more psychological warfare than legal." Nora didn't blink. She nodded, thanked him, and asked that the letter be sent certified, directly to Karen's address. No ambiguity. She left with a copy in hand and stopped at the hardware store to purchase 2 additional outdoor floodlights, motion-sensitive, high-lumen, and impossible to ignore. By the time she returned home, the mailbox was gone entirely. No debris, no post, just a clean patch of earth as if it had never existed. Nora stood there, heart hammering, not from fear but disbelief at the sheer audacity of the act. It wasn't vandalism anymore. It was erasure, not just a message, but a test of how much she was willing to let disappear before she pushed back. That night, she installed the new lights herself, adjusting the angles to capture the entire front yard and road. When darkness fell, the house didn't vanish into shadow as it had before. It gleamed, hard-edged and brightly outlined, as if daring anyone to step into its frame. But Karen didn't come. Not for 2 days. Then, on a Saturday morning, Nora walked out to check the area near the mailbox and found something far more disturbing than damage. A row of feathers, black, white, black again, laid neatly along the gravel, end to end, extending from the edge of the road up to her fence gate. Not dumped, placed. Too uniform to be random, too precise to ignore. She knelt, stared at them for a long moment, then turned and walked inside without touching a single one. That afternoon, she went into town and bought a trail camera, small and discreet, the kind used by hunters and researchers to track movement over long nights. She mounted it low on a tree at the corner of her property, camouflaged into the bark, aimed directly at the road. Not the porch, not the gate, the road. Because now, she wasn't waiting for someone to come to her door. She wanted to know who walked the boundary, who dared to get that close. The camera did not disappoint. The very next morning, reviewing the footage, she saw Karen, no surprise there, walking along the edge of the property line at 3:41 a.m., dressed in a housecoat and slippers, no flashlight, no phone. She wasn't alone. Behind her, a second figure, taller, male, walked at a slow, even pace, head down, hands in pockets. They never crossed the line, they never looked up, but the presence of someone else broke something deeper. This wasn't just a territorial grudge anymore, it was a performance. A message delivered with audience, deliberate and brazen. Nora took stills from the footage, time-stamped them, and brought them to Keene's office the following Monday. He reviewed them silently, nodding slowly. "We can escalate this. A civil protection order. Might not be granted immediately, but it starts a file. And that matters later." She agreed. The paperwork was filed. The court date was scheduled, but before that day came, another shift occurred. Nora began to notice small changes in the neighborhood, subtle at first, but insidious. The man down the street who used to wave no longer did. A car that usually parked 2 houses over was now regularly positioned just across from her driveway. And once, when she stopped into the grocery store, she caught the cashier eyeing her name on the debit card with a frown. The atmosphere had turned, not openly hostile, but colder, narrower, as if the town itself had retracted just slightly, closing her out. She had expected Karen's aggression. What she hadn't expected was the ripple effect, the slow pull of social isolation that came not with shouts, but with silence. That was when she began to suspect that Karen's reach didn't end at the fence line. That maybe the roots of her control ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Still, Nora stayed steady. She kept documenting, kept walking the perimeter every morning, kept her routine sharp and visible. But she also began reinforcing her space physically. She added gravel to the path leading up from the road, installed a secondary lock on the gate, and began keeping her phone beside her bed, always charged. She did not sleep deeply. She could not afford to. And yet, even in her exhaustion, she never considered leaving. Because every time she looked at the house, she saw not Karen's threats or the community's distance, but her own decision, her own stake planted in the earth, and she would not be the one to pull it out. Then, a week before the hearing, the real escalation came. She returned home one afternoon from an errand in town to find the back gate wide open. Not broken, not forced, just unlocked and swinging gently in the breeze. She knew with absolute certainty she had latched it that morning. She walked through slowly, noting no immediate signs of intrusion, but when she reached the shed, she froze. The door was ajar. She pulled it open fully and stared at the mess inside. Her gardening tools had been rearranged, nothing taken, but every hook empty, every handle laid across the floor in a perfect, unsettling row. And in the center, atop the overturned wheelbarrow, lay her second mailbox, the one she had stored after the first incident. Its wood split clean down the middle, like a carcass laid for inspection. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She closed the shed door, locked it, and walked inside. Then she called Keene, then the sheriff. When they arrived, she walked them through it all calmly, showed the footage, the photos, the logs. The deputy took notes, the lawyer asked questions, and together they concluded that whoever was doing this knew her patterns, knew how to enter and exit without detection, and most importantly, knew how to leave just enough behind to make her question what would come next. It wasn't about theft. It was about message, about control. That night, for the first time, Nora locked every door and window and pulled a chair in front of the front door. Not because she thought they would come in, but because she wanted them to know she was expecting it. And just before midnight, her trail camera blinked once more. When she reviewed the footage the next morning, she didn't find Karen. She found only the second figure. Alone, standing motionless in the road, facing the house for 13 full minutes before walking away without a sound. No movement, no gesture, just watching, as if waiting for permission. By the time the court hearing arrived, Nora had transformed the rhythms of her life into a kind of fortress. Every routine, every motion, every locked door and copied document became part of a larger strategy. Not just to protect her home, but to stay ahead of whatever logic governed Karen Aldridge's quiet campaign. And yet, as she sat in the county courthouse under flickering fluorescent lights and the hum of aging air ducts, she couldn't shake the sense that none of it would matter. The courtroom wasn't a battleground. It was a room full of paper, procedures, and people who had no investment in what this place meant to her. Karen arrived late, as if to remind everyone she could afford to be. She wore a soft gray sweater and neatly pressed slacks, her white hair pulled into a low twist at the nape of her neck. She looked less like someone being served with a protective order and more like someone there to settle a library fine. When the judge called their names, Karen didn't even glance in Nora's direction. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, expression blank, the very picture of a polite civility. The judge, a lean man with tired eyes and a tone that suggested he'd heard too many of these cases to be surprised by anything, listened carefully as Nora presented her documentation. She explained the mailbox destructions, the nighttime disturbances, the letters, the trail camera footage, the trespassing near the shed. Keene supported her statements calmly, laying out the timeline and evidence in his deliberate, clipped cadence. The judge asked a few procedural questions and took notes. Then it was Karen's turn. She spoke softly, as if burdened by the ordeal. She denied all involvement, said she had nothing against her neighbor, and that any incidents mentioned were either unfortunate coincidences or misinterpretations. "This has all gotten a little theatrical," she said, tilting her head toward the judge with a rueful smile. "I live across the street. Sometimes I walk. Sometimes I work in the yard. That's not a crime." When asked about the equipment rental, she shrugged. "I was regrading my driveway. Any treads left near her property were accidental. I can't be responsible for how gravel shifts after rain." She looked at Nora briefly, and for the first time since all of this had begun, her expression shifted. Just for a second, a flicker of satisfaction, subtle and cold, before she turned back to the judge and clasped her hands again. In the end, the order was denied. Not enough evidence of direct threat, no injuries, no confrontation, no proof that Karen had authored the notes or that the second figure in the footage had any connection to her. The court could only act on what could be confirmed, and though Nora had built a thorough case, it wasn't enough for intervention. The judge recommended ongoing documentation and suggested both parties avoid further interaction. And just like that, it was over. Nora stepped outside into the bright midday sun, feeling neither defeat nor anger, just a dense, slow-burning clarity. Karen had played the system exactly right. She had left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no overt aggression, only signs, suggestions, the kind of persistent unease that eats away at a person's ability to live without vigilance. That night, the house felt different. Not unsafe, but compromised. Nora sat at the kitchen table long after dark, staring at the yard through the window, her cup of tea cold in her hands. She'd played by the rules and lost. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the court would magically solve her problem, but she had hoped, quietly, foolishly, for a gesture of support, a signal that someone in authority would at least acknowledge the shape of the thing growing around her. But the law, she now understood, did not exist to prevent harm, only to respond to it once it had already taken something from you. The next morning, the third letter arrived. Not on paper this time, but carved into the side of her garbage bin. The words were shallow, scratched rather than etched, but unmistakable. Still here. She didn't report it. She didn't photograph it. She simply rolled the bin to the curb, as usual, and left it standing there for the rest of the day, exposed. A silent acknowledgement, a refusal to react. But her mind turned inward. She began to map not just Karen's actions, but the pattern they formed. Not random, not impulsive. There was a rhythm, a structure, a kind of choreography in how far Karen would go, when she would retreat, when she would press again. And if that was true, it meant there were rules to this game. Rules Nora had to decipher if she had any hope of winning. So she changed her approach. No longer just defense, no longer only preparation. She began talking. To neighbors, quietly, without accusation. Not about Karen directly, but about history. About the street, the land, who had lived there before. Most people were reluctant, wary of taking sides, but a few offered slivers of context. The house Nora lived in had once belonged to a man named Harold Wentz, a carpenter who died nearly 10 years prior. His daughter had sold the property to the bank during a foreclosure after a bitter family dispute, and before whence it had belonged to a woman named Doris Skinner, Karen's cousin. Not immediate family, not inheritance, but close enough to seed resentment when the property was sold out of the family line. Nora found this out from an older man named Theo, who lived down by the old Sawmill Road and ran a part-time auto repair from his garage. He remembered Doris, remembered Karen helping her plant the rose bushes that still struggled by the west fence. "That land's sentimental to her," he said, his tone cautious. "Doesn't mean she has a right to it. But folks around here, they don't let go easy. Especially when they think something was taken." Nora thanked him, went home, and walked to the fence where the rose bushes grew. They were dying, choked by weeds, roots curling back into the soil like they didn't want to be there anymore. She knelt, pulled a few free, and found beneath them a tiny rusted tag staked into the earth. Weather-worn, almost illegible, but the name was still clear. Doris, 1974. She left it there and stood up slowly, the dry sting of old metal clinging to her fingers. So that was it. Sentiment turned to spite. Memory weaponized. Not property loss. Legacy loss. And Karen had decided to reclaim it through pressure, through slow erosion of presence and comfort, until Nora either left or gave up so much of herself that staying felt like exile. But Nora didn't leave. Instead, she filed her own boundary request with the county, preemptive, precise. Not to move anything, not to claim more, but to affirm what was hers. She hired a surveyor to restake the property lines, documented every step, and mailed copies of the final report to the assessor's office and her attorney. The message was clear. You don't get to rewrite this. Not with grief, not with memory, not with passive war. That night, no one came to the road. No figures appeared on the camera. But in the morning, one of the rose bushes had been torn out of the soil. Not uprooted. Torn. Left in pieces on the gravel, its roots exposed, its flowers shattered. Nora stood over it, looked across the street, and saw Karen watching from her porch with a cup in hand, face unreadable. Nora didn't flinch. She bent down, collected the broken stem, and carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table. A reminder. Not of loss, but of line. The midpoint wasn't defeat. It was clarity. This was no longer about winning or proving. It was about standing. And Nora Blake was just getting started. The weeks following the Rosebush incident passed with an eerie kind of calm that felt less like a ceasefire and more like the pause between heartbeats before the next sharp contraction. Nora noticed that even the air seemed different, charged, watchful, like the house itself had begun holding its breath. She kept her routines, maintained her perimeter, responded to silence with silence, and moved through each day as if preparing for something just out of sight. She didn't speak to Karen, didn't acknowledge the increasing presence of small disturbances, the patio chairs she'd arranged in the backyard being found nudged 2 feet to the left, the garden hose uncoiled across the yard in a perfect spiral, the faint scent of someone else's cologne drifting past her window at night. These were not accidents. They were not random. They were rehearsals. And Nora understood that better than anyone. This wasn't a conflict, it was a campaign. And Karen wasn't just a bitter neighbor with time to spare. She was a tactician, someone playing a long, cold game with no intention of revealing her full hand until the target was too destabilized to resist. Then, on the first clear Saturday in April, Nora returned home from the post office to find a vehicle parked halfway onto her property, one tire crushing the edge of her newly planted flower bed. A silver sedan with tinted windows and county plates, engine still idling, driver absent. She approached it slowly, noting the cracked taillight and faded emblem. Government issue, but aged. Before she could call it in, a woman appeared from around the side of her house. Tall, lean, clipboard in hand, wearing a utility vest with a laminated badge clipped to her chest that read, Zoning Review Officer, County Development Committee. She smiled too quickly and greeted Nora with the kind of practiced ease reserved for people who expected to be listened to without question. She explained that an anonymous request had been submitted for a zone reassessment of Nora's property, citing inconsistencies with original parcel designations and non-conforming structural modifications. Nora blinked once, lips tightening. What structural modifications? The woman's smile didn't fade. Your driveway expansion and recent fence realignment, according to the report. Nora laughed. There's been no expansion. I added gravel, and the fence hasn't moved. It's been there since the 80s. The woman made a vague note on her clipboard. I'll need to complete the perimeter survey. Standard protocol. I won't take long. Nora didn't argue. She didn't threaten. Instead, she asked the woman to wait, stepped inside, and returned with a full binder of documentation. Original property lines, permits, and a notarized survey completed only weeks ago. She handed them over, watched the woman flip through with increasing discomfort, and stood calmly as the official finally murmured, "This appears to be an order." Nora didn't smile. You should check the origin of that anonymous complaint, and next time, maybe use the driveway like everyone else. The woman left within minutes, her demeanor crumbling under the weight of facts, and the sedan disappeared down the road in a haze of dust and humiliation. But Nora's heart didn't settle, because this wasn't Karen's style. Karen didn't call offices, she didn't invite bureaucrats. She preferred subtlety, implication, the quiet erasure of control. Someone else had escalated, or Karen had changed tactics. 2 days later, it became clear which. Nora received a letter in the mail, this time official, an HOA-style community board, which Nora wasn't legally part of, had voted to include her street into its jurisdiction, pending final approval. The language was deliberately vague, full of conditional phrasing and civic jargon, but the implication was immediate. Control over her property, her right to make changes, plant trees, repaint her siding, could soon fall under a group she'd never joined. And at the bottom of the proposal, under the section listing supporters, was Karen's name, not just as a participant, as community liaison. That night, Nora sat with the letter under a single bulb in the kitchen, her breath steady, her eyes scanning every line. She didn't panic. She researched. She called the county office, then a land use attorney in the next town. She filed an immediate objection, citing exemption, previous title history, and original deeds that clearly defined her property as outside any communal jurisdiction. And then, with calm finality, she posted a physical notice on her fence. Privately owned, exempt from community regulation. Unauthorized governance attempts will be prosecuted under state code. She printed the statute number in bold. Not for Karen, for anyone else watching. But the most direct act came 2 days later. Nora returned from the hardware store and immediately knew something was wrong. Not broken, moved. The energy of the house had shifted. Her porch chair was tilted slightly. A curtain she never left open was drawn back 2 inches, and the latch on the side gate that she always tested twice before leaving now hung loose, swinging in the wind. Inside, nothing was stolen. Nothing was visibly out of place, but her bedroom smelled faintly of antiseptic, like someone had touched something and wiped the evidence clean. She checked her cameras, front, back, side, all blank. Power loss for a 2-hour window. She checked the circuit. No overload, no explanation. Just silence. That evening, she stayed awake. Not with lights on, not with a weapon in hand, but with her eyes open and her instincts sharpened. Around 2:17 a.m., her motion sensor lit the backyard. She moved quietly to the window and saw it. Not Karen. A man, dressed in black, heavy jacket, baseball cap, walking along the edge of the shed, not hurried, not hesitant. He looked up once, toward the camera, then directly toward the house, and tapped something in his pocket. The lights shut off. Not broken, overridden. And then he was gone. Nora didn't sleep. In the morning, she replaced the entire system. Hardwired it this time. No Wi-Fi vulnerabilities. No power line dependencies. She contacted Keene and relayed everything. He asked carefully if she wanted to escalate to police. She paused, then said yes. Not because she expected results, but because the line had been crossed and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. 2 officers arrived that afternoon, walked the property, took notes, listened politely. One of them, younger, a little too casual, asked, "You think this neighbor lady's got someone doing this for her?" Nora met his eyes. "I think this neighbor lady doesn't believe in doing anything directly. I think she's been watching me erode for months, and now she's testing how much she can take before I give up." The other officer, older, more serious, said, "This isn't small stuff anymore. We'll make a report. But I'd recommend you keep someone around. Family, friend, just in case." Nora nodded. She didn't have anyone nearby, but she didn't say that out loud. That night, she slept in the living room with the lights off and the house wired tight. And at exactly 3:08 a.m., her phone buzzed. Motion detected, backyard. She opened the live feed. No one. But when she checked the recording the next morning, she found it. A single frame. A figure standing just outside the camera's peripheral detection zone. Barely visible. Watching. Still. Face turned just enough to avoid clarity. But unmistakably familiar. Karen's posture was easy to recognize, even in silhouette. But what chilled Nora wasn't the presence. It was the fact that Karen knew exactly where to stand to not be seen. And had done it anyway, as if to say, "I know your limits, and now you know mine." This was no longer territorial, no longer passive. This was a siege, a test of thresholds. And Nora understood that the next move wasn't about law or fences or proof. It was about resolve. And hers hadn't cracked yet. But the pressure was rising, and Karen knew it. It was the first Sunday of May when Nora's patience reached its terminus. The day began unremarkably, with the soft crackle of the kitchen radio playing classical static and the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn 2 streets over. The sun was sharp but not cruel, and for a fleeting hour she believed the weekend might pass without provocation. She baked, something she hadn't done in months, and let the smell of cardamom and browned butter seep into the wood grain of the old house. She watered the plants. She swept the porch. She checked the cameras, the doors, the locks. Everything remained still, undisturbed. The quiet was so complete that she began to suspect even Karen might have retreated, at least momentarily, into whatever nest of bitterness she called sanctuary. That illusion shattered at 4:23 p.m., when the ground began to shake. At first, Nora thought it was a large truck rumbling past, some diesel delivery veering too close to her gravel road, but the sound was wrong. Too low, too close, and growing louder with each passing second. She stepped onto the porch and saw the dust before she saw the machine. A bulldozer. Not industrial-sized, but powerful enough, wide and yellow, with thick treads that churned up the edge of the pavement as it rumbled toward her mailbox. The third one she'd installed, now braced in concrete. Behind the tinted glass of the cabin sat Karen Aldridge, back straight, face impassive, one hand on the throttle. She didn't look at Nora. She didn't hesitate. The front blade came down with a mechanical whine, caught the mailbox at full speed, and split the post clean in half, sending splinters flying like shrapnel into the air. Nora didn't move. She didn't scream. She stood still as the machine rolled to a stop, engine idling, dust settling like ash around them both. Karen remained seated, unmoved, fingers resting lightly on the controls. And then, with the slow precision of someone fully aware of what she was doing, she shifted the blade again, this time toward the edge of Nora's lawn. The line. The divide. The place that had been contested not by words, but by glances, gestures, years of silent encroachment. The implication was clear. If no one was going to stop her, she would take the ground itself. Nora stepped forward, not running, not shouting, but with deliberate calm, and raised her hand in the universal sign to stop. Karen didn't move. Nora crossed the short stretch of gravel, boots crunching, hair pulled back from her face, and climbed onto the low step of the dozer. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low but firm. "You do this, and there's no going back. Not for you. Not for me." Karen turned her head slowly. Up close, her face looked different, not wild, not angry, but strangely serene, as if this destruction was not an act of rage but of ritual. "This isn't yours," she said. "It was never supposed to be yours. You don't belong here. The land knows it. Everyone knows it. You're temporary." Nora didn't answer right away. She looked at the hands on the controls, pale, veined, age-spotted, but steady. Then she looked at the edges of her own lawn, the porch she had painted, the trees she had trimmed, the soil she had turned over with her own fingers. "I paid for it," she said. "I take care of it. I live on it. That's what makes it mine." Karen shook her head, almost pitying. Ownership isn't paperwork. It's history. It's legacy. Nora's voice didn't change. "Then history ends here." Behind them, a neighbor's door opened. Another down the road. It was too loud to ignore now, too bold. The machine had drawn them out. Witnesses, finally. Karen seemed to notice this because her hand twitched briefly toward the throttle. But she didn't move the blade. Instead, she exhaled slowly, stepped off the pedal, and climbed down without another word. She left the engine running. The dozer idled in the road, half on gravel, half on lawn, its blade stained with dirt and wood. Nora didn't follow her. She stood beside the broken mailbox, hands at her sides, and waited. A full 2 minutes passed before one of the neighbors approached, a man she'd seen before but never spoken to. "We called it in," he said. "Sheriff's coming?" Nora nodded. "Good." She didn't ask who "we" was. It didn't matter. The silence had finally cracked. When the sheriff's deputy arrived, Karen was standing in her own driveway, arms crossed, calm and unreadable. Nora showed the video from her camera, the footage sharp and unambiguous. The deputy didn't say much, but he took notes, radioed for backup, and asked Karen to come with him. She complied without protest. There were no handcuffs, no grand spectacle, just a quiet, decisive shift in balance. As the patrol car pulled away, Nora turned back toward her house and saw the damage for what it was. Not just physical, not just splinters and divots and crushed grass, but symbolic. This was the last move Karen had, and she had played it in daylight, in full view, without shame. The machine was towed within the hour. The sheriff's office called 2 days later with confirmation that Karen would be facing charges: property damage, trespassing, reckless endangerment. The town, once silent, had found its voice. Statements were given, affidavits signed, and though Nora knew the legal process would be slow, she also knew that the tide had turned. Karen could no longer operate in the shadows. The game was exposed. The town had been forced to see. That night, Nora sat on her porch as the sky turned violet and the stars blinked into place one by one. The broken mailbox lay at her feet, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the pressure of watching eyes. No motion lights flickered, no figures stood in the road, just wind and the distant creak of settling wood. She didn't replace the mailbox immediately. She left it there as a reminder, not of defeat, but of resolve. She had not been pushed out. She had not backed down. And when the line was crossed, she stood her ground and held it. Inside, her phone buzzed with a new message. Keene confirming that restraining orders were being filed, that Karen's rights to approach the property would be legally restricted, and that the town council had withdrawn the community board annexation proposal due to ongoing review of procedural improprieties. Nora stared at the screen, then turned it over, letting the silence settle again. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. She just breathed. Long and slow. Because victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Like clarity. Like a house that finally belonged to no one but her. Summer came slowly to Arbor Creek that year. The kind of season that didn't announce itself with sudden warmth but crept in through the trees. Soft and steady. Like a tide reclaiming familiar ground. The grass grew higher. The birds returned. The evenings stretched out longer, quieter, the way they used to be before Nora's days had become measured in motions and shadows and the weight of someone else's resentment. The house, once tense and alert beneath her skin, had begun to exhale. The walls no longer creaked like warnings. The air no longer carried the scent of unease. For the first time since moving in, Nora felt the full, unspoken presence of space that belonged to no one but her. Space that was no longer contested, no longer monitored, no longer under siege. Karen Aldridge had not been seen since the incident with the bulldozer. The court hearing came and went in a quiet procedural sweep. She pled no contest to a reduced charge and was ordered to remain off Nora's property indefinitely, fined for the damage, and placed under formal community watch. She sold her house 3 weeks later. No one saw the moving truck arrive, but by the time it left, the porch was stripped, the windows shuttered, the lawn overgrown with neglect. There was no goodbye, no note, just absence. The town didn't talk about it much, not directly, but something had shifted in the way people approached Nora after that. A subtle nod from a neighbor who once looked the other way. A friendly greeting at the post office. The occasional wave from a passing car. She wasn't embraced with open arms, but she was acknowledged, accepted, not as a guest, but as someone who had endured. And endurance, she learned, earned its own kind of respect in places like Arbor Creek. She didn't make new friends exactly. That had never been her aim. But the air became less heavy, and the silences no longer pressed against her ribs. The land recognized her now. The rhythm of her days returned, not as defense, but as choice. She planted again, not just to cover scars, but to build something. Tomatoes, lavender, climbing ivy that took to the side of the shed like it had been waiting for permission to grow. She rebuilt the mailbox one last time. Steel post, reinforced mount, bold red flag that snapped clean into place. She didn't need it to look pretty. She needed it to stand. There were nights, still, when the wind changed and the sound of gravel shifting outside made her spine stiffen. But each time, it passed. Nothing appeared. No one came. The cameras remained on. The doors remained locked. But the feeling no longer ruled her. It was part of her now, like a healed wound that still tingled when the air got cold. She didn't ignore the past. She didn't romanticize it. But she didn't let it grow roots in her mind. That was Karen's way. Fixating on what had been, trying to possess through memory what time had already moved past. Nora had chosen a different path. She lived in the present. She lived in the place she had earned, not just with money, but with presence, with proof, with refusal to be erased. One morning in late July, she received a letter, not anonymous, not threatening. Official, from the county records office. It was a simple acknowledgement of the boundary case, closing it formally with the affirmation that no changes would be made, that her claim stood unchallenged, unaltered. It wasn't a surprise, but she framed it anyway. Not out of pettiness, out of principle. She hung it by the door, not as a trophy, but as a marker, a reminder that some things, once stood for, do not move. The paper was light. The fight it represented was not. As the season deepened, she started walking further down the trails behind her house, path she'd once avoided out of precaution. Now she moved freely, boots pressing into earth with purpose, steps no longer shortened by tension. She knew the sounds of this land now, the birds, the wind, the groan of old trees. Nothing here startled her anymore. The fear that once nibbled at the edges of her peace had been replaced by something quieter. Assurance. Not that bad things wouldn't happen again, but that she would meet them when they did, with eyes open and shoulders squared. By the time August settled in, the ivy had reached the roof line, the tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and the nights turned cooler. Nora sat on her porch most evenings now, not watching, not guarding, but simply being. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she let the silence fill her ears like water. And sometimes she looked across the road, not at Karen's old house, but at the space it had once taken up in her mind. It was just a structure now. Empty, not haunted, not dangerous. Just another house waiting for its next story. It no longer had anything to do with her. The town continued on. Quiet, unassuming, persistent in its routines, just as it had before her, just as it would after, but now it held her within its shape, not as a cautionary tale, not as a target, but as someone who had arrived and stayed and stood her ground when standing mattered most. She didn't need to be liked. She didn't need to be understood. She only needed to be home. And she was,